What's going on, everyone? In today's episode, we're planting tomatoes, and that's always a fun time for me, but I thought it'd be even more fun to go through all the things that I wish I would have known when I was first starting out gardening about tomatoes. Let's go. The first thing that I wish I would have been told about planting tomatoes when I was starting out gardening is that you don't have to space them out as much as a lot of people say you do. Now, tomatoes, they are a really easy crop to grow, and they do take up a lot of space if you let them. That's really the secret. You see, how we grow tomatoes is we grow a method called single stemming, and we grow a variety of tomato called indeterminate. Now, there is a determinate tomato and an indeterminate tomato. I won't bore you a lot with the details, but basically, a determinate tomato just has a determined height, a determined fruit set, and everything about it is kind of predictable, whereas an indeterminate grows all season long. And that tomato can be grown up a single stem. Determinants are typically more bushy and a little bit more just kind of wild looking, whereas indeterminates can be grown up a stake, and all along the stem of the tomato, they produce suckers. You pull off those suckers as they form, keeping a nice, orderly, organized plant all the way up. And what it allows you to do is it allows you to space your plants out about every 1.5 feet versus every 3 feet. It's a huge difference. That means you can put twice as many tomatoes in the same amount of space. So yeah, I really do wish I would have learned that, because I'll tell you what, my first few gardens I had, boy, they were spaced. They were real spaced. Second thing I wish I would have known is that you can and should plant your tomatoes deeper. That's because tomatoes are a vine, and everywhere that the stem touches soil, it'll set down new roots. And I think that's great to know, because when I first started out gardening, I would put them just basically right at soil level. And you had all of this plant exposed. And a lot of times your plant gets a little bit top heavy in early season before it has a chance to kind of strengthen up in the wind and the nice full sun. And when you're dealing with that top heavy plant, it only takes one strong wind to kind of knock it over and snap it. Lost a lot of plants doing that. But when you plant it deeper, the amazing thing is that not only is it more sturdy, but it also is going to set down more roots, which means a healthier, more resilient plant later on. So what we're going to do is we're going to take off those lower leaves down there, allowing us to plant this whole stem right here. We're going to backfill, and now what would have been about a foot tall plant is now only maybe 7-8 inches. Really, really helps to get a sturdier plant and, like I said, a more well-established one. The third thing that I wish I would have learned is just how many varieties of tomatoes there are. Now, when I first started gardening, there was not that many tomatoes that were accessible to you as a gardener. You go to your local greenhouse or garden center, and they'd have a Roma, they'd have a beefsteak, and they might have like a cherry tomato. It was so limited. And I'm actually really proud of the gardening movement, because we've really brought heirloom tomatoes to the forefront and made them more accessible. They were still accessible then, but you had to start from seeds. Nowadays, you can go to your local garden center and pick up quite a few different varieties of heirloom tomatoes. But back in the day, I didn't really start a whole lot from seed, and that was a big mistake, because I ultimately sacrificed so much biodiversity. Varieties that now I grow every single year, like this amazing Abe Lincoln tomato, the backstory on that, crazy by the way. Or this black Brandywine, so cool. There are so many different varieties, and to be honest, there's over 5,000 different varieties of open pollinated and heirloom tomatoes. You just have to be willing to start some from seed. Had I been willing to do that, or a little more risky with my gardening, I was very safe. I just wanted to start with whatever the garden center had. I only grew a beefsteak and a little cherry tomato. It was a little pear tomato. Those are the only two that I had in my garden, and man, I look back and I'm like, those were some pretty sad times as a gardener. I had fun, but man, I couldn't imagine how much more fun I'd be having had I found these amazing varieties. The fourth thing that I wish I would have learned is the fact that you don't need to fertilize as much as you probably think. Now, when it comes to fertilizing tomatoes, we use Trifecta Plus, and we'll use just 2 little scoops, about a 1/4 cup. We only fertilize one time the entire season. But when I first started out gardening, I'll admit it, I'll raise my hand, it's okay, we all learn things. I would fertilize the absolute daylights out of my plant, thinking that the more I fed the plant, the healthier it would be, and the more fruit I would get. Not flawed in that thinking, you know, it makes sense. However, most plants in the garden actually don't work that way. You see, the fruiting process is actually the process of stress. It's the byproduct of stress. You see, these plants here, as long as they're growing and they're happy, they're not incentivized to produce fruit, because producing fruit actually takes a ton of energy, and that energy ultimately can sometimes even kill the plant. And so the plant doesn't want to set fruit. But what you have to do is you have to tell it to set fruit. And that typically happens later in the season as the weather starts to change, as the plant starts to mature, use up some of the nutrients in the soil. That actually kind of shifts to other priorities, such as reproducing. But in the early season, if all you feed it is nitrogen, which helps with plant growth and leaf development, you're going to end up with this gigantic, super tall, green, bushy tomato that you're going to think is probably the healthiest tomato plant on earth. And you're not wrong. You're actually correct. It is probably the healthiest tomato plant on earth. The problem is a super, super, super healthy tomato is not incentivized to produce any fruit. And so what you need to do is fertilize one time with a nice all-purpose, preferably organic fertilizer like Trifecta or whatever you feel comfortable using. And when you use that, it's ultimately going to give the plant what it needs throughout the growing season, and the plant will actually thank you for it in the form of more fruit. Now, I can safely say that this is probably one of the biggest mistakes gardeners make, hands down. I think probably one of the biggest. And it's not just with tomatoes. It's with every vegetable in the garden. We over-fertilize. Carrots, you get pretty tops but no roots. Beets, you get pretty tops and no roots. Radishes, pretty tops, no roots. Beans, tons of foliage, very few pods. Tomatoes, big plants, not a lot of fruit. It's that way with every single plant. And so I'd highly encourage you all to just heed my word of caution and learn from my lessons. You know, don't over-fertilize your plants. They really don't need it, especially if your soil is already nice and rich and fertile to begin with. The fifth mistake that I wish I would have learned when I was first gardening was not pruning certain tomatoes. Now this ties back into what I was talking about with determinate and indeterminate. You see, a indeterminate can continue to grow all season long, and it produces those suckers. And as long as the weather is warm, it's sunny, and your plants are getting lots of nutrients, they're going to continue to grow, and they're going to continue to fruit all along the way, but they're also going to continue to produce suckers. And as we prune our plants up, we take off those suckers. You don't want to do that with a determinate tomato. And the reason why, like I talked about, is because that plant has a determined height, a determined fruit yield. It's meant to be bushy. It's meant to be a more compact plant. And so if you end up pruning off those suckers, you're literally reducing your production by up to 75%. And so it is very important that you know what you are growing and how to prune that plant. Because, like I said, indeterminates, no problem at all. They're going to continue to grow. You'll have an 8-foot tall tomato plant by September, maybe even taller. And it'll be producing all season long, giving you bucket loads of tomatoes. But if you're growing on a patio, that's unrealistic. You don't want that. And so in our garden here, we grow indeterminates, but in our, in pots or in containers, we grow determinates because we don't want that really tall, top-heavy plant we have to manage. So bushier tomatoes are better. But if we were to prune those suckers off, it'd be super bad. And honestly, I have made that mistake well into my 4th or 5th year gardening, maybe even further than that. So don't feel bad if you have pruned a determinate tomato thinking you were gonna help it and ended up hurting it. I've done the same. So lesson learned, don't make that mistake. Okay, the 6th thing, and this is a really big one for me. And this is actually one of the latest lessons that I've actually learned. I learned this lesson that I'm about to talk about only about 4 years ago, so relatively new. And it was the realization that crop rotating your tomato plants does not reduce your chance of blight. Be really clear there because it's a very common misconception. People will say if you have blight on your tomato plants, whether it be early blight or late blight, that if you move them around, that it's going to prevent it. Blight is a soil-borne fungus. It actually stays in this soil here. It's in all soil. And then when it gets on your plants, it produces spores, and those spores blow. There is nowhere on Earth, besides maybe the North and South Pole, that is immune to blight spores. And so if you're growing tomatoes, regardless of where you're growing them in your garden or how many times you rotate them around, you're still going to at some point get blight. The biggest control from getting blight or preventing it is healthy plants. Healthy plants. Having a stress-free plant, one that has enough nutrients, one that has enough water, that's growing in enough sunlight, that doesn't have pest problems, those plants are going to be far more resilient to, almost forgot my fertilizer. Those plants are going to be far more resilient to things like blight than a plant that is stressed. And that's because a stressed plant has a weakened immune system. And a weakened immune system is just like you and I do. We're more likely to get sick. And so keep your plants healthy and they will stay blight free. Now, all plants at some point will get blight because the weather conditions start to get colder, they start to get wetter, the daylight gets less. So naturally, at some point, you're going to get blight. But you're gonna have a lot less risk getting it earlier by just keeping your plants healthy. All right, and the 7th mistake that I made as a beginning gardener planting out tomatoes was not realizing that the tomato cages they sell at the store really should not be tomato cages. They are better at holding up peppers than they are tomatoes. Now, I get it. If you use them for tomatoes, that's fine. But I could not recommend a really strong T-post, like we have our metal T-posts here, a nice good wooden furring strip, or even a homemade tomato cage made from concrete reinforcement. We've got videos on how we do all those. There's so many different types of tomato cages out there, but those little cone-shaped tomato cages that are only like 4 feet off the ground will do absolutely nothing for a tomato. And I say that from experience. I've had so many blow over, I've had so many break, the welds break. It's a joke. And I'm only saying that because I don't want to see you make that mistake. Leave them there or use them for your peppers. They're great for your peppers, just not so great for your tomatoes. So even though they're called tomato cages, disregard. And I can tell you that from many, many, many learned experiences. So I hope you all enjoyed. I hope you all learned something new. If you did, make sure to hit the like button, subscribe if you haven't already, check out our other videos, and we'll see you all on the next episode. As always, grow bigger. Bye. Hey, thank you so much for watching today's video. I really appreciate it. If you enjoyed, consider checking this one out. You'll probably enjoy it just as much. I want to thank you so much for your viewership, because without it, this channel would not be as amazing as it is. If you haven't subscribed yet, it's free. Consider doing that. We upload every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, rain or shine. And if you need any garden tools, supplies, or seeds, check out MIgardener.com. We got you covered. See you guys in the garden. Bye.